Good morning, everyone. Seeing the time of 10:05 having arrived, I'd like to gavel down and call the subcommittees on transportation, maritime security, and cybersecurity, infrastructure protection, innovation to order. Today's hearing marks the first hearing of this Congress for the Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security. I'm excited to be chairing this subcommittee in this Congress and to be joined by our ranking member, Congresswoman Lesko from Arizona. And I understand she's getting snow in Arizona.
We were. It was
you
crazy. In Phoenix.
Save the water. We have a great panel of distinguished members on both sides of the aisle, and I look forward to working with all of you to tackle the security challenges facing the transportation and maritime sectors. I'm glad to hold our first hearing jointly with the Cybersecurity Subcommittee and its leaders, Chairman Richmond and Ranking Member Katko, who, Mr. Katko, unfortunately, is not able to join us today. I'm also happy to welcome our two panels today of witnesses, and I look forward to your testimony. We're here today to discuss a very important topic: cybersecurity in our nation's mass transit, rail, pipeline, and other surface transportation systems. Cyber threats are a growing concern for security experts across many sectors, and the surface transportation sector is no different. Millions of Americans, we rely on surface transportation every day. An attack against a large subway system or pipeline could have hugely negative effects on all of us. Government and industry have both struggled to address cyber threats, which have evolved quickly and have become more and more complex. And I believe DHS is well positioned to lead cybersecurity and the efforts across critical infrastructure sectors, including the surface transportation sector. Last year, Congress established the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISCA, making clear its status as a preeminent cybersecurity agency within the federal government. CISA works closely with TSA, which is responsible for securing all modes of transportation. In December of 2018, working with CISA, TSA released a cybersecurity roadmap that sets priorities for securing transportation from cyber threats. The roadmap is an important first step in the right direction, but it has to be followed by concrete action. In coordination with CISA, TSA must ensure owners and operators have access to the resources, intelligence, guidelines, and assessment needed to ensure the cybersecurity of their systems is as good as it can get. Government and industry stakeholders together must also address supply chain security concerns. We must make sure that surface transportation systems are not made vulnerable to cyber espionage due to unchecked foreign manufacturing of subway. Some have questioned whether DHS has paid enough attention to pipeline security and have raised the idea of moving responsibility from securing pipelines to another department. And Ms. Proctor, I do hope you address that issue during your comments. This would go against the reasons Congress established DHS, TSA, and CISA. Only DHS has the scope of authorities and access to intelligence needed to address cyber threats across critical infrastructure sectors. DHS had made significant progress in securing pipelines, including recent updates to TSA's pipeline security guidelines, and it should be allowed to build upon these ongoing efforts. This hearing provides a great opportunity to discuss the work of both government and private sector to ensure all modes of transportation are secure from cyber threats. And I look forward to a very productive conversation. Now I'd like to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. Lesko, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you that are here today, including the people coming as our testifiers. First, I'd like to ask people to keep Representative Katko in your prayers because his father passed away, and that's why he's not here today. And so Mr. Chairman, I do ask for unanimous consent for Representative Katko's statements to be added to the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding a hearing today on this very important topic. TSA has security authorities over America's surface transportation modes, including 6,700 mass transit systems, passenger and freight rail, as well as motor coach in both rural and urban communities. In addition, pipelines are considered a mode of surface transportation for natural gas and hazardous materials. Across the United States, including in my home state of Arizona, TSA is responsible for securing more than 2.5 million miles of pipelines carrying natural gas and other materials that quite literally fuel our economy. While much progress has been made to provide better physical security for surface transportation, there remains growing concern surrounding the cybersecurity of our nation's surface transportation assets. As cyber actors become more sophisticated and surface transportation systems become increasingly reliant on computer systems, the vulnerability of this critical sector grows, along with the risk posed by nefarious actors who may seek to exploit cybersecurity vulnerabilities to cause service disruptions or conduct economic espionage. In general, surface transportation systems utilize a number of interconnected information systems that, when exposed, present cybersecurity vulnerabilities. According to the American Public Transit Association, cyber attacks against surface transportation operators can destroy an agency's physical systems, render them inoperable, hand over control of systems to an outside entity, or threaten the privacy of individuals or customers. In the 115th Congress, the Republican majority worked in a bipartisan manner to enact the TSA Modernization Act, the first ever authorization of TSA since the agency was created in 2001. We also enacted the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency Act of 2018, which created CISA in order to reform critical security programs within the department and better equip DHS to support the cybersecurity of transportation systems. Additionally, TSA Administrator Pekoski has worked to restructure the agency to reflect evolving mission needs. It is important to note that while threats against our transportation sector may be evolving, they are not diminishing. Legitimate concerns have been raised as to the ability of TSA to provide necessary security for surface transportation assets, and particularly pipelines. While I believe TSA is best positioned as the government's authority on transportation security, it is incumbent upon the agency to demonstrate its commitment to securing all modes of transportation. The Department of Homeland Security and its components must work to mitigate growing cybersecurity threats and work hand in hand with industry partners to promote a culture of security and keep America's economy fueled and moving with the public's confidence. I do look forward to hearing the testimony before us today, and thank you for being here, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to recognize the Chair of Homeland Security, Mr. Benny Thompson, for some opening remarks, sir.
Thank you very much, Chairman Correa. Ranking Member Lesko, on your maiden voyage as Ranking Member, welcome. I also like to express my sympathies to Ranking Member Katko in the loss of his father. But also this hearing today is very important. The cyber threats facing the U.S. surface transportation sector. Since 9/11 attacks, the U.S. government has focused on closing gaps in physical aviation security by federalizing passenger and baggage screening, hardening cockpit doors, and deploying improved screening technologies and training. In September 2018, the subcommittees held a joint hearing highlighting the potential harm from an important undisclosed vector, cyber threats in aviation. Today, we will provide the same attention to cybersecurity threats to the surface transportation sector, with TSA's dedicating most of its resources to protecting aviation. The surface transportation sector, including freight and passenger trains, commuter rails, mass transit, buses, and pipelines, present a relatively soft target for mass casualty attacks. We rely on these diverse assets not only for our shipping and other transports of natural gas and a host of other activities essential to the health of our economy and national security. In recent years, surface transportation systems overseas have been hit by terrorist attacks. On our own shores, New York City's subway was a target of a failed terrorist plot in December 2017. Given the level of risk to surface transportation, I'm concerned that we've not sufficiently protected this sector against cyber threats. To date, no cyber attacks have disrupted the actual operation of surface transportation systems, but attacks have resulted in financial disruption and affected public confidence in various modes of surface transportation. These small-scale attacks have shown that a relatively simple intrusion could upend surface transportation services, causing significant harm and disruption. Last year, Congress established Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, as the operational agency within the federal government. Security information sharing. CISA will continue to play a critical role in providing cybersecurity resources within DHS, including to TSA, to industries to combat cyber threats, to critical infrastructure. TSA, for its part, maintains responsibility for the security of all modes of transportation. Working together within DHS, CISA, and TSA are uniquely positioned to address cyber threats in transportation. I'd note that DHS's authorities and capabilities across critical infrastructure sectors and all modes of transportation makes it better positioned to secure pipelines than the Department of Energy, despite some suggestions to the contrary. In December 2018, the coordination of CISA, TSA released its first ever cybersecurity roadmap, providing a vision for the future of cybersecurity across all modes of transportation. While DHS is headed in the right direction, much work remains. In many cases, surface transportation sector owners and operators struggle with the same cyber challenges that plague other industries: a national shortage of skilled cybersecurity personnel, a workforce with minimal cybersecurity training and awareness, and resource constraints across the board. Finally, at a hearing on surface transportation security, I'd be remiss if I did not point out that TSA remains non-compliant with requirements to publish surface transportation security regulations, which were enacted over a decade ago in the implementation recommendations of the 9/11 Commission Act of 2007. And I'd like to, at some point, Mr. Chairman, hope to get a response to why we've not had that take place. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson, for those opening statements. Now I'd like to recognize a co-chair of this hearing today, Mr. Richmond, Chairman of the Cybersecurity, Infrastructure Protection, and Innovation Subcommittee, for an opening statement. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Benny Thompson from Mississippi, and I will also join my colleagues in extending my condolences to Congressman Katko, as a person who's lost two fathers. I understand what he's going through, and we wish him the best. I want to start by congratulating Congressman Carrera on becoming chairman of the Transportation and Maritime Security Subcommittee. I look forward to working with you to improve the cybersecurity posture of our transportation infrastructure. Last fall, our subcommittees held a joint hearing to assess cybersecurity risk to aviation. We learned that cyber threats to aviation are persistent, that cyber tools can be used to engage in cyber espionage or undermine confidence in the aviation industry, and that the safety of air travelers requires us to stay a step ahead of bad actors. In short, we learned that cybersecurity posture of the aviation sector is a national security, economic security, and public safety imperative. The same can be said for the cybersecurity posture of our surface transportation systems. Surface transportation includes roads, rail, maritime facilities, and pipelines, and my district is rich in all of them. So I'm glad that we're beginning the 116th Congress with this hearing. Compared to that aviation sector, surface transportation receives relatively little in federal funding to support security. Outside of the Transit Security Grant Program, which is awarded to public transportation entities and primarily used to secure against physical threats, surface transportation owners and operators foot the bill for security themselves. But the federal government is not off the hook. It plays a critical role in providing the situational awareness, security assessments, and guidance to stakeholders that inform surface transportation security investments. In the decade and a half since it was established, the Department of Homeland Security has matured its ability to convene stakeholders, leverage its cross-component expertise, and share actionable intelligence analysis and guidance to help address pressing national security challenges. Whether or not the federal government can effectively partner with stakeholders to secure surface transportation modes from cyber attacks rests on DHS's ability to continue to perform and build on these capabilities. Approximately 125,000 miles of pipelines valued at $1.9 billion move oil and gas through Louisiana every day. The industry employs over 2,500 people in the state. Toward that end, I was pleased that the Pipeline Cybersecurity Initiative was one of the first priorities announced by the new National Risk Management Center last year, and updated pipeline security guidelines were finally released last March. I'm encouraged that the department is redoubling its efforts to improve the cybersecurity of pipelines by enhancing the in-house collaboration between CISA and TSA and engaging with the private sector. I believe the Pipeline Security Initiative has the potential to provide a more comprehensive understanding of the unique cybersecurity risk to pipelines, particularly as the sector relies more on the industrial Internet of Things. That knowledge will empower stakeholders to address cybersecurity risk more strategically. Although the initiative was first announced as one of the NRMC's initial sprint, I hope that it will evolve into a more permanent collaboration. I am concerned, however, that the updated pipeline security guidelines do not address supply chain risk management. Moreover, I will be interested to know how TSA is implementing the 10 recommendations the Government Accountability Office made in December related to its management of pipeline security program. The safety of my community and the economy of my district depends on DHS getting this mission right. I would be remiss if I did not also raise my concerns about the cybersecurity posture of both passenger and freight rail, particularly as passenger rail cars incorporate automatic train control, network and train line control, and monitoring and diagnostics, among other technologies. Last month, I read troubling reports of a Chinese rail company significantly underbidding competitors to win transit rail contracts in 4 major markets. I'm aware of China's political and economic ambitions. The intelligence community and Congress have been clear in cautioning against the use of Chinese telecommunications products. But it is unclear to me whether the federal government has assessed what, if any, additional cybersecurity threat is posed by contracting with a Chinese company to purchase rail cars with advanced technologies. It is also unclear whether the federal government is providing any guidance to local transit authorities to ensure cybersecurity is incorporated into their procurement process. I look forward to discussing these issues with the witnesses today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Chairman Richard. Richmond, I also like to congratulate you on your chairmanship and look forward to working with you as well. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. And with that being said, I welcome the first panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. Bob Kolaski, who serves as Director of the National Risk Management Center at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at the Department of Homeland Security. As director, he oversees the center's efforts to facilitate strategic cross-sector risk management approach to cyber and physical threats to our critical infrastructure. And next, we will have Ms. Sonia Proctor, who serves as director of the Surface Division within the Office of Security Policy, or OSP, at the Transportation Security Agency. Ms. Proctor's responsibilities include developing risk-based and effective security policy in collaboration with stakeholders in surface transportation modes. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted into the record, and I will ask each witness to summarize his or her statements in 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Kolaski. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Correa, Chairman Thompson, Chairman Richmond, Ranking Member Lesko, and members of the subcommittee. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to testify regarding the Department's ongoing and collaborative efforts to strengthen the cybersecurity of our nation's critical infrastructure. Today, as the subject of the hearing, I will focus my remarks on surface transportation, including pipelines, mass transit, freight rail, and our highways. First, however, I do want to thank the committee for its leadership in establishing the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. By creating our new agency in law, Congress formally recognized DHS's role as the leader of the national effort to safeguard federal networks and critical infrastructure from cyber and physical threats. CISA delivers organization-specific and cross-sector risk management support to enhance the resiliency of our nation's critical infrastructure. We are the main federal interface for sharing cyber threat indicators. We provide a broad range of cybersecurity threat detection, response, and coordination capabilities to assist industry across all sectors, including surface transportation, with securing their operations. Our capabilities bring together the intelligence community, law enforcement, international partners, and the private sector. As part of CISA, I serve as the director of the National Risk Management Center. The center brings together industry and government for collaborative planning, analysis, and prioritization in order to reduce risks to critical infrastructure. These efforts complement and support the day-to-day operations across our agency and are intended to focus on the most significant risks facing the nation's critical infrastructure. To that end, cyber threats remain one of the most significant strategic risks for the United States. Critical infrastructure cyber incidents, however, are rarely sector-specific, which means we can't afford to take a sector-specific approach to risk management. Our adversaries target common vulnerabilities and systems across sectors. They target companies in one sector to launch attacks on a In addition, the growing interdependencies across sectors demand an integrated approach. An attack on the transportation sector that has operational impact can transcend the operations of just the transportation sector. That's one reason why we did establish the National Risk Management Center. Planning, operations, and information sharing to secure critical infrastructure must not be stovepiped. This is because of the global, borderless, interconnected nature of cyberspace, where strategic threats can manifest in the homeland without advance warning, and speed of collaboration is essential. In the coming months, the National Risk Management Center will finalize the identification of a set of national critical functions. National critical functions are defined as the functions of government and the private sector so vital to the United States that their disruption, corruption, or dysfunction would have a debilitating impact on national security, economic security, national public health, or safety. We've identified these in partnership with industry and our colleagues across government. Through this process, we've already identified functions associated with surface transportation, such as the movement of commodities through pipelines and the generation of electricity that need to be prioritized. Because of that, last year, as you all mentioned, we launched the Pipeline Security Initiative to build upon past work in the sector. This effort is a partnership between CISA, TSA, the Department of Energy, as well as industry. CISA is coordinating risk management planning and tasking its cybersecurity operators to provide technical capabilities and capabilities in support of my colleague Sonia and her team as the sector-specific agency. TSA's relationship with the sector and understanding of pipeline operations is critical to the success of this initiative. The Pipeline Security Initiative is conducting cybersecurity assessments on pipelines to identify and mitigate vulnerabilities. The first comprehensive assessment was completed in December 2018, and we expect to do 9 more this year. These are some of the most comprehensive, in-depth cyber assessments the U.S. government has done on pipelines to date. Based on these assessments, the NRMC will be conducting initial analysis of how best to reduce risk to the nation's pipeline infrastructure, working with industry to prioritize mitigation activities. Another example of our work to support the transportation sector is industrial control security. Much of our nation's surface transportation is dependent on industrial control systems to monitor, control, and safeguard operation. We at CISA have a long history of working to provide technical expertise and share information with ICS vendors, and we will include to do that with a focus on surface transportation. The final area I want to talk about the National Risk Management Center's efforts are efforts around supply chain security. To address supply chain risks, CISA has established an Information and Communications Technology Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force as a public-private partnership to facilitate mitigation of emerging supply chain threats. Work is ongoing on 4 separate work streams intended to improve threat information, better understand priority supply chain risks, and incentivize and enhance supply chain risk management. This work will help transportation sectors as well as critical infrastructure and federal networks. In closing, CISA will continue to be a partner to our government and industry colleagues with the twin imperative of addressing the cyber threats we see today and shaping the risk environment of tomorrow. I'm convinced that such an approach will leave us better prepared to address any challenges we face from our adversaries now and in the future. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittees today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kolaski. I will now recognize Ms. Proctor for testimony. If you can summarize your statements in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Thompson, Chairman Correa and Richmond, and Ranking Member Lesko, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you this morning to discuss the Transportation Security Administration's efforts to secure surface transportation systems, including oil and natural gas pipelines, from cybersecurity risks. I also want to thank you for the TSA Modernization Act and the support of that. TSA is committed to securing the transportation sector, which includes pipelines, against evolving and emerging risks such as cyber attacks. Partnering with our private sector partners to secure surface transportation from cyber attacks is a critically important and complex undertaking. The U.S. surface transportation system is a complex, interconnected, and largely open network comprised of mass transit systems, passenger and freight railroads, over-the-road bus operators, motor carrier operators, pipelines, and maritime facilities. The various modes that make up this system operate daily in close coordination with and proximity transportation system operating securely and safely. Every year, more than 10 billion trips are taken on 6,800 U.S. mass transit systems, which range from small bus-only systems in rural areas to large multimodal systems in urban areas. Over-the-road bus operators carry approximately 604 million intercity bus passengers each year. Over 3,300 commercial bus companies travel on the 4 million miles of roadway in the U.S. and on more than 600,000 highway bridges and through over 470 tunnels. Those same roads, bridges, and tunnels support the movement of goods throughout the country by 8 million large-capacity commercial trucks. As for our railroads and pipelines, more than 570 individual freight railroads carrying essential goods operate on nearly 140,000 miles of track and 2.75 million miles of pipelines owned and operated by approximately 3,000 private companies transporting natural gas, refined petroleum products, and other commercial products. TSA's functions and authorities as a security agency are uniquely structured to tackle the challenges at the intersections of surface transportation and cyber risks. To secure these networks, TSA leverages its mature intelligence and analysis capability, along with its vetting and credentialing programs, to ensure it can quickly develop and promulgate risk mitigation guidelines and measures to effectively efforts are bolstered by strong partnerships, trust, and collaboration with our federal and industry partners. In this regard, industry works with TSA to share their own unique vulnerabilities and security needs. Through this open communication, we collaboratively develop programs and guidelines for industry to voluntarily adopt to increase their overall security posture, an approach that has yielded significant security investments and improvements beyond what the agency would have achieved from a regulatory approach alone. We believe that this voluntary and collaborative approach to developing and implementing security measures has been successful. However, we also recognize that should the need arise based on an imminent threat or real-world event, the TSA administrator has unique authority to require immediate implementation of certain security measures through the issuance of security directives. In December of 2018, the TSA administrator issued the agency's cybersecurity roadmap, which will guide efforts to prioritize cybersecurity measures within TSA and across the transportation system over the next 5 years. TSA approaches both cybersecurity and physical security by identifying, assessing, and mitigating the risk. TSA helps surface owners and operators identify vulnerabilities and risks in their operations and works with them to develop and implement risk mitigating solutions. In closing, TSA has been able to support the improvement of both physical and cyber security across all surface modes of transportation, including pipelines, thanks to the trust and relationships we have cultivated with our federal partners in industry, as evidenced by the programs and resources TSA has collaboratively developed and implemented for our surface transportation stakeholders. TSA is committed to securing the nation's surface transportation system from terrorist activities and cyber attacks. TSA looks forward to working with Congress on these efforts, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss these issues here with you today. I look forward to the subcommittee's questions.
Thank you, Ms. Proctor, and I thank both of our witnesses for their comments and remind the members that each one of us will have 5 minutes for questions. I'll now recognize myself for some questions. Ms. Proctor, I'd like to start out with you. TSA currently relies on voluntary standards for pipeline. Tell me, is this good or bad?
The approach that we use for working with the pipeline industry has been very successful. Yes, we indeed do use a voluntary approach. Our pipeline security guidelines were developed with industry, and they were developed to allow a voluntary involvement with the pipeline industry. What we know is that with these guidelines, we have flexibility to adjust the guidelines to the threat environment. And certainly if the threat dictates, if there is a significant threat, the administrator of TSA has the authority to issue a security directive to focus on that threat and to require security measures to address that specific threat.
So, Ms. Proctor, are you saying because of the characteristics of cyber attacks that specific regulations would be counterproductive in this area?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. The nature of cyber threats is that they are constantly emerging. They are emerging much faster than the government's ability to write regulations to address them. And in this fashion, if there is a significant cyber threat, the administrator may address that through a security directive.
Any thoughts about how you would keep us as policymakers apprised of your progress or lack thereof, since you're looking at really at voluntary standards, self-reporting?
Mr. Chairman, we would be happy to report to this committee on our progress with industry, on the progress of the assessments that we conduct with industry. We actually go out and conduct corporate security reviews, looking at the headquarters planning, the planning for cybersecurity plans, physical plans, and we go out into the field and conduct assessments at critical facilities. We conduct critical facility security reviews in the field, and we're comparing what we see in the field to the agreed upon pipeline security guidelines.
Complying with the cybersecurity challenge can be very expensive for the private sector or government. So my question to you is, the private sector, do you see them complying voluntarily with what they've got to do, which is come up to the best practices, minimum standards, or do you have to push folks to go in the right direction? Do you have to push folks to do the right thing?
Sir, what we have witnessed is that the voluntary approach has been very successful. We have found that the companies are making those investments in their own cyber security as well as physical security, and they are doing that to protect their ability to carry on their business as well. So we do believe that it has been effective in this voluntary environment.
Quickly, another area, the realignment. TSA is realigning some of its functions. Can you explain to us how this realignment will affect surface transportation security?
As a result of the realignment that Administrator Pekoski has directed, the surface division assets are going to shift over into the security operations area, where they will join with our transportation security inspectors who are already in the field. That field force is 200 plus strong. So we will be combining our surface division, our current surface division assets with the 200 plus transportation security inspectors in the field. They will be working with us in conjunction with our transportation security partners in the field.
Thank you very much. I'm going to yield the remainder of my time and now recognize our ranking member for the Transportation Subcommittee, the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. Lesko, for some questions. Ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question is for either Ms. Proctor or Mr. Kowalski or both. Some have suggested that other federal agencies take over the role of physical and cybersecurity for pipelines, such as the Department of Energy. And I was wondering if one of you or both of you can comment on why you think that it's important that it remains under the purview of TSA and Department of Homeland Security.
Thank you, Ranking Member. We do believe that the security of pipelines is best placed under the Department of Homeland Security, and the assets that the Department of Homeland Security can bring to bear for the security of the pipelines. As has been mentioned here today, we're working very closely with CISA to conduct comprehensive cybersecurity assessments on pipelines. And the authority that I mentioned that the administrator, the TSA administrator has, gives him the authority to require whatever measures are necessary to secure the pipelines to be implemented almost immediately at his direction to secure the pipelines from any type of threat, whether that threat is a cyber threat or whether it is a physical threat.
And if I could just add to that, Ranking Member Lesko. You know, one of the things we recognize, Sonia and I in our office has recognized, is that we have some unique capability across DHS that we can apply to the pipeline threat. And within the agency, the partnership we've established has really, we're served as a force multiplier to TSA's cybersecurity efforts. And the other thing I would augment that with, and why I think this is a good place for it to be, is the fact that a lot of the nature of these risks, the control systems, the fact that pipelines contribute to other critical infrastructures are cross-sector, and we really are a place, and we serve as the hub to bring information across sectors. When we learn about risks to some operational technologies, we can quickly get in the hands of TSA to get out to the pipeline owners and operators. We work together on that. There's just a lot of shared risk in the space, and separating critical infrastructure too much across agencies, you know, really runs the risk of creating stovepipes. I mean, right now we've got a nice blended mix of working with agencies. We work closely with the Department of Energy, but I don't think you want to take cybersecurity responsibilities out of DHS and put them further afield, because that then will just challenge.
Thank you. And I have one more question for Ms. Proctor. Let me just read this from my notes. Recently, the GAO determined that, in a recent audit, determined that highest risk had failed to identify critical facilities due to a lack of clarity from TSA on defining a facility's criticality. To remedy these challenges, GAO recommended that the TSA administrator take 10 actions with which TSA concurs. What actions have been taken so that these high risks are identified?
Yes, ma'am, and certainly we have reviewed the GAO report. We concur with the recommendations that GAO offered, and we are in the process now of addressing those recommendations that were made by GAO. As you noted, there were 10 recommendations that were made by GAO, and 4 of those recommendations deal with the pipeline risk ranking tool that we use to help establish risk in the pipeline industry. So we are diligently working on all of the recommendations, but we do expect to have at least the first recommendation concluded within about 60 days.
Thank you, ma'am. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Ms. Lesko. Now I recognize the chairman of the Cybersecurity Subcommittee, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond.
I'll pick up where the ranking member left off, and Mrs. Proctor, your answer indicates that you will accomplish number 1 out of 10 in 60 days. What about the other 9?
Mr. Chairman, we are working on all of those 10 recommendations at the same time. We have limited resources to work on all of them at the same time, so we are working to address the ones that we know that we can satisfy, and those involve, again, there were 4 that were associated with the risk ranking tool. So we're working directly on those, as well as the one that addresses the policy that we need to put in place for the review of the actual guidelines.
Let me just give you kind of an overview of my district, largest petrochemical footprint in the country. We are neighbors to chemical facilities. We have all of the major rail lines running through our communities, and for the most part, they are good corporate neighbors, good employers, and they pay well. However, when we look at the risk associated with that, we have to make sure we mitigate it, because on those rail cars that come through our communities are dangerous chemicals and every other thing that you can think of. So when we're looking at, are we communicating the best? Do we have strategic partnerships set up? It's important to us. And so as we talk about the cyber risk for, let's say, rail and our pipelines and our oil rigs and all of those, that now a lot of that is controlled electronically. And if you think of the BP disaster, which was an accident, think of a BP disaster that was an attack. So how are we communicating with those companies, but have we done anything to make sure that those companies are holding their subcontractors and their supply chain to the same high standards that we want to hold them to?
So I can talk a little bit about sort of the nature of your question. As you know, you mentioned chemical, through the CFATS regulation, we put additional requirements on chemical security. Some of the facilities are dealt with that. You referenced the oil and natural gas industry, which operates pipelines, produces a lot of what you're talking about. We work closely with the oil and natural gas industry, with the Department of Energy. Specifically in terms of supply chain risk, we agree that this is an area that we got to get deeper into, people understanding the supply chain. I think there's an understanding of that. I referenced in my opening remarks a task force that we've established with critical infrastructure owners and operators, which are focused particularly on threat information sharing, setting up processes by which threat-based decision-making, where should threat-based decision-making criteria be established? That will be an interagency process where we're able to get threat information out to help owners and operators make a decision about companies or products they might not want to insert in the supply chain. We are advocating more deeply understanding what is in a supply chain. That's an important element. But then there's also has to be mitigation steps. You know, are people is that written in the expectation to do so in the contracts? That's the kind of stuff we're studying in the task force to make recommendations to the federal government how to do that for our own federal networks, but also for critical infrastructure owners and operators, and what incentives will get people deeper in. So, you know, I would summarize the problem that we probably don't have enough information out there to help everyone be as smart a buyer as they could. In talking to industry, we'll understand why information might not lead to the right decisions being made or us taking too much risk on. We don't want to deal with this by just cutting off things, but we want a better understanding of risk that's being put into supply chains, and when there are that could be put out there.
Well, and I guess I'll just say before Ms. Proctor takes a shot at it, but think of passenger rail, which is almost completely electronic. What are we doing to ensure the traveling public safety? And do we have a sense of urgency understanding the risks that's out there? And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Chairman Richmond. The Chair will now recognize other members for questions they may want to ask. In accordance with our committee rules, I'll recognize members who were present at the start of the hearing based on seniority in the committee, alternating between majority and minority. Those members coming in later will be recognized in the order of their arrival. The Chair recognizes for 5 minutes a gentlelady, Ms. Barragan from California.
Thank you, and I'm going to actually follow up on the question that Congressman Richmond just asked. In December of 2016, LA Metro received a terror threat from abroad. It led to heightened security, and this terror threat was on a commuter rail station, one that went into downtown Los Angeles, impacted about 150,000 riders a day on this line. And so my question was very similar to what Mr. Richmond just asked, but didn't get an answer from, so I'm going to follow up there. When we talk about cybersecurity risk, to what degree are we considering the safety of the traveling public as well? And passenger rail and mass transit rely on computerized systems. A cybersecurity attack on the system could also mean risking the safety of the traveling public. What is being done to mitigate these risks to the public and both?
Is provide both information and intelligence. And that intelligence is delivered sometimes in an unclassified setting, but it's also delivered in a classified setting. That is one of the most important things that we do, is keeping the systems informed about the level of threat, the type of threat, which gives them the information that they need to apply mitigating measures to that particular threat. In conjunction with the supply chain issues that my colleague mentioned, those issues put them in the best position to ensure the safety of the traveling public. Most of our transit systems have either their own law enforcement component, or they have an agreement with their local law enforcement agency to provide security for the system. We have found them to be very engaged. We have found them to be involved not only in receiving information, not only from TSA, but from our colleagues at the FBI, with the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and with their to be effective. And when we receive information that suggests that some threat is present in mass transit, you will often see an increased visibility of uniformed law enforcement officers, including the Viper teams from TSA, the ground-based federal air marshals who support our surface transportation. We take that information very seriously, and as soon as we receive information that suggests that there might be some threat to the system, and whether that threat is physical or cyber, we reach out to those systems to make sure that they're aware so they can start to apply mitigating measures.
Great. Mr. Kowalski, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, let me talk too specific about the rail. So Sonia mentioned information sharing. We know a lot about cyber information, cyber things that might be happening, but one thing we did a couple years ago is work with the rail industry to attach cyber indicators, things that could be happening in terms of tactics, techniques of a cyber attack, to controls that would be most useful in a rail in a rail transit context. And so, we took general information and we organized it by using the NIST cybersecurity framework, working with industry, where we could take specific indicators and say, if you see this sort of stuff, here's what you might want to do in a rail system. It's that customization that helps. And then I would just add on the physical security, which you referenced associated to 2016. I mean, another thing we do at DHS is really try to enhance soft target security and technology development that can be deployed in transit settings through our Science and Technology Directorate partnership with TSA. Stuff through funding in transit systems. So, we're getting better every day.
Recruiting and retaining a skilled cyber workforce is something the DHS and this committee has had a top priority to do. Historically, CISCA has struggled to fill important cybersecurity positions, and I understand that TSA is also looking to grow its cybersecurity workforce. Mr. Kowalski, does the new National Risk Management Center have enough of the right people to carry out the ambitious goals you described without depleting personnel from other parts of CISA?
We've all pledged not to cannibalize each other, so I think that's a good strategy here. We started with a good basis of analysts who have experience thinking about strategic risk, analyzing strategic risk, doing planning, but we'll be continuing hiring as we go forward to establishing the National Risk Management Center. We have about 20 positions that we're in the process of filling. As a director of an organization, I always want more talent. We're going to be pushing for it. I think we have the ability to recruit people. Becoming the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency is motivating us to get better candidates. We're using tools, incentives to hire people and things like that, but we want to keep pushing.
Thank you, Ms. Bargan. I'll now call on the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Rice, for 5 minutes of questions.
Familiar with one of the largest subway systems that we have in this country, the New York City subway system. It is a system that services 5.7 million people every single day, traveling through 472 subway stations and across 662 miles of track. And it's 1.8 billion people per year. So I wonder if there is a strategy specifically, and I need to look into this with the NYPD, which I think is probably one of the premier law enforcement agencies that you work hand in hand with. Is there a strategy, and more importantly in New York City, where everyone is very impatient and likes to get from point A to point B as quickly as possible? After 9/11, everything changed about how you traveled when you went to the airport. Is there a public appetite for that kind of security system before you enter any system? And I guess this is really a rhetorical question. So that's just to throw that out there. I mention the impatience of New Yorkers because anything that slows down their travel is something that they would probably squawk about. But, I would hate to have that be instituted after a terrible tragedy happens, where the appetite might be more. Ask you about is China's growing footprint in the U.S. industrial supply chain and infrastructure. They are rooted in part by the emergence of the state-owned China Railway Rolling Stock Corporation, CRRC for short, which I'm sure you're all well aware. But they have won 4 out of 5 large U.S. transit has won contracts with the Metropolitan Transportation Authorities in Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Another source I believe, of the anxiety around these acquisitions concerns the development that CRRC won these contracts by placing low bids. Many critics point to the fact that the company received support from the Chinese government through state subsidies, which other contractors do not. But also, you have members of Congress, the Pentagon, and industry experts that have stated concerns about China's capabilities in deploying Chinese-manufactured subway rail cars to engage in cyber espionage and surveillance. Now, similar to the government's concern when it comes to Huawei in the telecommunications field, what is the level of concern that either one of you have? And I guess this is a supply chain question as well, but it seems to me that this is like a big red flag. I know that New York does not contract with CRRC, but just your thoughts on that. It seems like just such a huge red flag.
So, two versions of thoughts. One, that we have to do what we can to protect our information to not allow China to use business and increased threat and risk out there. If you ask our specific concerns about any one of these, it's less about whether it's CRRC or anything, it's about what practices have been put in place to make sure that risk isn't being introduced into the system. And so, this really comes into procurement questions. Do we have tight procurement? Let's please not go with the lowest bidder price-wise. If you're a Metro Transit Authority, let's make sure that they hit pretty tough security requirements, and then you can make a price-based decision. But the security requirements have to be built into the contracts. There has to be, part of those security requirements is looking at the manufacturing, where the manufacturer's going, getting eyes on as a procurer with technical expertise to make sure risk isn't being introduced at the point of manufacture. How you set up the maintenance contract. So I don't want...
You set up those requirements, or at least the laundry list of things that states and municipalities should look at. How many states adhere to them?
So, I mean, we're still in the process of working with the transit authorities. We had a conversation on Friday where we shared some intelligence information around that to help make decisions. Right now, I think there's an opportunity to put, for companies to put greater requirements into procurement language. That's something that TSA and us will be working with the industry on.
So what would be the pushback against adhering to your guidelines?
I think when you talk to a chief operating officer, security officer, they want to do that. It's pressures that they get from other pressures and making decisions. Yes. So, we understand that these decisions are trade-offs. We want to be on the side of pushing hard for security, recognizing that there are other pressures that businesses face and transit authorities face.
Whether it is interference in our election process, which is well documented. I mean, we have so many vulnerabilities across so many fundamental infrastructure outfits in this country that we have to have a serious conversation about this. And I just think that if you're going to set out guidelines, we have to try to understand why states are not going to adopt them and abide by them if you are the agency from whom they're supposed to be getting this.
Sure there's good procurement in there. We agree. We'll set the guidelines. We'll help them do that. When security-based procurement decisions or security-informed procurement decisions are not happening, that's where the executive branch and the legislative branch should have a conversation about what are the limitations for that happening. I don't want vulnerabilities to turn into risk. There are vulnerabilities, as you said, but let's really take a risk-based approach to where the priorities should be for activity.
And when you come up with those guidelines, what data are you using to kind of push that information out? What are you basing your concerns on in terms of the supply chain, the procurement process?
Based on, first of all, scene systems, so where we see vulnerabilities I'll stick with elections for exception. We've gone out and we've worked with states and counties to look at their election systems, see some common vulnerabilities, to do that. Also working with the vendors on areas to understand, areas where additional guidelines would help their own security side. And taking advice through these protected conversations through the Critical Infrastructure Partnership Advisory Council structure where we're hearing about why me as somebody who wants to make a security decision don't feel like I have all the information I need to make the security decision. So it's these conversations that help us.
Do you have anything you want to add? Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Rice. And now I'll call on a gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome our witnesses here today, and thank you for your testimony. Before I begin, I just wanted to mention I concur with Chairman Thompson and keep the pipeline cybersecurity in the realm of TSA and not see it shift over to DOE. So I think that's an important point to make, and I'm glad that it's been raised here today. Obviously, with all this, and I think this hearing is essential to focus on transportation security, especially relating to cybersecurity. These are the things that keep me up late at night. Is where can the most damage that can be done, and is in the area of critical infrastructure in a number of fields, and so. One of the aspects I wanted to focus on today is on pipeline security, and obviously you need the right policies and procedures, plans put in place. You need the right people and with the right expertise. And so, Ms. Proctor, let me start with you. December 2018 GAO report indicated that staffing in the Pipeline Security Division was a major challenge with the number of FTEs ranging from 14 all the way down to 1 across several fiscal years. What is the current staffing level of the Pipeline Security Division?
Today, the current staffing level is 5, but I think it's important to say that with the realignment that's been directed by the administrator, we will be shifting into the security operations organization, where we will have the benefit of the additional transportation security inspectors in the field. Now, there are 200 plus of them that will serve all of surface transportation. So our pipeline section will be much larger. We will draw from that pool of transportation security inspectors to provide the training and the experience to put them in the pipeline section.
How many do you estimate will be specifically dedicated to pipeline security? Are you talking about they're going to be leveraged across all those fields, and from time to time they will rotate into the pipeline security? I'm not clear in your answer.
Well, we think the pipeline section is going to require specialized training. So we are going to put those people in there, provide the training, and make sure that they are qualified to go out and do those assessments. We've not arrived at a final number yet. We're still working on some of the staffing issues for the shifting of personnel because it will serve all of our surface transportation partners in a way that's going to allow us to put more people in the field working directly with our surface transportation partners.
And so of the 5 that you mentioned, those staff, how many have expertise in cybersecurity specifically?
Cyber?
Yes.
I'm sorry, we have none that have specific cyber security expertise. They do have pipeline expertise, but not cyber expertise.
I find that a troubling answer, but let me ask you, across all of TSA's surface transportation workforce, how many specialize in cybersecurity?
TSA does not have cybersecurity specialists. We rely on our colleagues at CISA for cyber expertise. We recognize that, that's a specialized field, so we do rely on the DHS experts to provide that input, and we worked directly with them when we were developing the pipeline security guidelines and got input from them to develop the current pipeline security guidelines that have a cybersecurity section in them.
Okay. So staying on the topic of pipeline security, approximately, you said how many critical pipeline systems are there again in the United States? I think we talked about this earlier on, but.
That number varies depending on mergers and acquisitions. The number we work with is somewhere around 120.
Okay, so I the end of the year, I mean, in your view, given the number of pipelines that we're talking about, is that adequate? Because it doesn't seem so to me.
I don't want to suggest that those are all of the pipeline assessments that we do. So we still do critical facility security reviews, and those are separate from the 10 comprehensive cyber assessments that we're doing with CISA. So we'll continue to do those critical facility security reviews. We completed 62 of those last year, even given the resources that we're working with now. But the 10 that we're referring to are going to participate in the comprehensive cyber security assessments that we're doing with CISA.
Before my time runs out, I wanted to ask you, Ms. Proctor, again, the TSA cybersecurity roadmap provides for the development of an implementation plan to see it put into practice. So had the actual implementation plan been developed?
We're in the process of developing that plan now. We recognize the priorities in the cybersecurity plan and the value that it's going to bring to us in surface transportation. That plan is relatively new, but we're reviewing that plan now to determine how we can implement that in surface transportation.
When do you think the plan will actually be finalized? And is Congress going to be provided a copy of that? Because we would like a copy.
We would be happy to provide a copy of that finalized plan, and I can certainly provide you an update on when we believe that's going to be finalized. We are, as indicated, we're working through a number of requirements right now, including the GAO requirements, so we are working on all of those concurrently.
All right. I know before my time runs out, I just wanted to ask this, though. How do you expect with the rollout of the roadmap, and what additional resources, if any, are required to carry out, you believe, the new plan once it is finalized?
The cybersecurity roadmap is going to require more coordination with CISA, and we'll have to determine the resources based on how we see that plan rolling out and how we see it being implemented across all of the surface transportation modes. But we've been working very closely together, so those are some things that we're going to have to continue to work on to ensure that we can carry out the administrator's intent on that plan.
But the resources are going to be factored in as the plan is finalized. You're working through those additional resource requests now as well.
I'm sorry.
You're planning for additional resource requests once the plan is finalized, is what I'm hearing you saying, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Langevin. I would like to call the gentlewoman from New Jersey, Ms. Watson-Coleman, for 5 minutes of discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for your testimony. What is the greatest threat from a cybersecurity attack on the pipeline? Is it that it would cut the flow of the natural gas? Or is it that it would blow up? What is it?
So we recognize that the threats to pipeline from a cyber perspective do exist. Most of our significant pipelines are controlled to some extent by computer systems that manipulate valves and switches and controls. Right. So that impact would more likely affect the operation of the system. We would assume that it would affect more the operation of the system, the flow, perhaps, of the commodity.
Uh-huh. Is there any other kind of threat that could result in either a leakage or an explosion that could be triggered by some nefarious actors?
So I think we'd like to have a follow-up conversation with you about threats where we can be more specific in a different setting. I don't mean to put you
Okay.
off, but I think that's more appropriate.
Okay, because I am concerned. Do you work with FERC at all?
Yes, ma'am, we do.
Because in New Jersey, in my district, there is a Penny's pipeline. And I visited a home, and the pipeline is going through that person's yard. And as close as you are to me is as close to the pipeline is to the woman's bedroom. And so things like that concern me about the siting of these pipelines. But in addition, FERC hasn't had the responsibility, the requirement of seeing what other pipelines are in the vicinity and that could be somehow accessed so that we don't have so many pipelines, we just have the efficiency that we need. And you don't deal with that issue with FERC at all in terms of siting, right?
No, ma'am, we don't deal with the issue of siting at all. We do work closely with FERC, and we've conducted cyber architecture assessments with FERC. So
But that's not proximity, that's not location, that's infrastructure, right?
correct.
If we have to have this conversation in another setting, but we keep talking about the vulnerabilities that exist either in supply chain or in cybersecurity or in any way impacting the safety and security of any rail transportation, any pipelines. And we say that we are doing things to advise our clients, whomever, of these vulnerabilities. Can you tell me in this setting, A, how we identify these vulnerabilities, and B, how does the procurer ensure that there's language or whatever that protects that item that they're purchasing that is being built by China or anybody else? Is that something that we can discuss here?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, first of all, I want to reinforce that most of these worst-case scenarios, there's a lot of fail-safes, there's layered defenses built in here, and one of our overall strategies is to get better to make this stuff, the worst case that you're imagining, incredibly complex and only accomplishable by having physical access or doing things that are likely to be picked up by a layered defense system. And so, first and foremost strategy, it's better understanding what's already put in place and putting in places to share information as quickly as possible. When you make something really complex, just like with a terrorist attack, you're more likely to see the plotting that's going on there. Mm-hmm. And we've come a long way in that direction. Our adversaries might continue to get better, but by making things complex, it's a good risk management strategy.
But I also want to know about when you're purchasing rail cars. What is it that you tell the agency that is advertising? These are the things. These specific things are how you mitigate the possible compromising of the safety and security of your car or whatever.
Sure. So at a basic level, we give them an overview of business practices of companies and links to Chinese intelligence doctrine, things that are available to understand that there may be other risks introduced into the system, and then we talk through what good procurement strategies are. I
want to assume worst case scenario, that we are purchasing cars from a company that means us no good. I want to know specifically, how do we protect against, what do we look for specifically to make sure that whatever thing is that might compromise the safety of that car and its passengers. Mm-hmm. How do we see it? How do we know it? How do we look for it?
Leads to a follow-on discussion. The last thing I would say, that one of the things we're bringing in from a procurement perspective is the federal government as a whole has experience in procuring things that are really, really important to us and need to be secure. And so part of what we can do at DHS, working with some of our folks who do even bigger procurements, is bring some of those practices, share that with industry around, so the relationship with us and DoD and that sort of fact, and the testing that goes on in national labs, that stuff's really important to get to the level of fidelity you want.
So I thank you. My time is up, and I just want to say, Mr. Chairman, I somehow would like to have a discussion in another environment as to exactly what these things are.
Love to do that if we can.
Thank you very much.
I'll talk to the staff and Ms. Watson-Coleman. Let's see if we can do that. Thank you very much. And for 5 minutes of questions. Thank you.
Yes, hi. Sorry to be late. I apologize. And I'm happy to be the only one at this giant table down here. And apologize if this is slightly repetitive. I, like some of my other fellow congressmen and women, have pipelines going through my district, some of them extremely close to the homes. Many of them, the route had been changed without the citizens' awareness, and there's a lot of citizens who are concerned about their safety, as we all would be. So can you just walk me through, in sort of clear terms, number one, what you've done to prevent cyber attack, and then number two, if there's a specific threat or risk. I'm from the intelligence community, former CIA officer, and was definitely aware that there was plenty of time. There were classified information, threats, concerns, new techniques that were classified, so we couldn't actually communicate with local businesses, with local communities, local law enforcement even, on the real nature of that threat. So what are we sort of doing to protect ourselves? And then tell me about your modus operandi on presenting information down to unclassified users.
So with regard to the threat, and this goes back to our information sharing, 2 weeks ago, I believe we had a classified briefing with members of the industry. It was a top secret classified briefing to talk about the threat. As a matter of fact, tomorrow we have another meeting with another classified briefing with industry. And so we have found ways with our intelligence colleagues of providing the necessary information that the industry, our industry partners need in order to protect their industry from cyber threats. So from the intelligence perspective, we have been able to manage that with our intelligence partners. I don't believe that there has been an unresolved issue with the intelligence that we're providing. We're providing everything that we can provide in the appropriate atmosphere with people who have the appropriate clearances. So in terms of the information, I believe that we are getting that out to the right people. On the cyber side, I'm going to let
And you referenced community level law enforcement. This is where the fusion centers that DHS sponsors come in very handy. They're somewhere around 85 around the country, and both with industry, but more particularly with law enforcement and people who have influence on community level decisions. Teleconferences and things like that. And then implied in your question, obviously, is not everyone's going to have a clearance no matter how good we get at doing that. So you know, we want to push on getting more out of the unclassified assessment. As you probably can guess, what was in the Worldwide Threat Assessment that Director Coates talked about, that takes a while to get that statement to be made, but that statement becomes important because it lights a fire on the importance of this issue, and we've been following up with industry, both in the classified and unclassified and communities based on that.
So related to that, if there was an incident and because of declassification or problems with sharing, that information did not get to the company, who's the senior accountable official who would be responsible for that mishap, would it happen?
We've given out, we within CISA have the ability to give private sector clearances out, so we will facilitate private sector members getting access to information. Depending on the nature of the information you're talking about, it is it is on us as a government who has that information to get it as quickly as possible to the cleared community. I'm not going to speculate on the exact hypothetical. It's our job to make sure we have opened up the channels to get classified information. We and other parts of the government also have one-day read-in authorities where if you don't have a clearance, but you need to have this information. And so, I think we all feel obligated to make sure that information gets in the hand of somebody who can do something as soon as possible once we know that it's credible information.
Okay, I would just say, again, CIA and FBI weren't communicating particularly well during 9/11. There has to be accountability if there's mistakes. I'm not saying anyone's, God forbid, planning for a mistake, but it is nice to know that, who is responsible for making sure we push down this information to industry. But I'll yield back the rest of my time.
Of witnesses for your comments. Now, if I may, I'd like to take a 5-minute recess and then come back and start with our second panel. And members, please try to be back in 5 minutes. Thank you very much. Committee will now come to order, and we will start with our second panel. Our first witness is Mr. James Lewis, serves as Senior Vice President and the Director of the Technology and Public Policy Program at the Center of Strategic International Studies. And next we'll have Ms. Rebecca Gagliostro, my apologies, Gagliostro, who's the Director of Security, Reliability, and Resilience at the Interstate Natural Gas Association of America, which is comprised of 27 members representing a vast majority of interstate natural gas transmission pipeline companies. Next, we'll have Mr. Eric Olson, who's the Vice President of the Rail Security Alliance, which is a coalition of North American freight rail car manufacturers, suppliers, unions, and steel interests. And finally, we will have Mr. John Holquist, who serves as Director of Intelligence and Analysis at FireEye. He has over 10 years of experience covering cyber espionage, hacktivism, and has worked as senior intelligence analyst positions at the Department of State. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted to the record, and I will ask now each witness to summarize their statements for 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Lewis. Thank you. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, and I thank the committee for the opportunity to testify. We've entered an era of connected devices, sometimes called the Internet of Things, that offers real economic benefit, but comes with increased risk to Homeland Security. And much of this risk comes from the global supply chain. Most infrastructure and transportation systems, as you've heard, are connected to the internet in some way and depend on computers for their operation. This includes electrical power systems, pipelines, telecommunications, and increasingly vehicles, which continuously connect back to their manufacturer, wherever that manufacturer is located. And these connections provide opportunities for espionage and service disruption. As the committees have heard for many years, the state of cybersecurity remains poor. Most networks can be hacked, cybercrime continues to grow, and cyber attack is an essential part of state conflict. Our task is to mitigate risk. One way to do this is to ask how a device connects to the internet, what information it transmits, and how much transparency and control an operator has over this data and connection. Another way is to use 3 metrics: the value of data collected, the critical valuable data, perform critical function, or whose disruptions could produce mass effect, need to be held to higher standards. Currently, the Internet of Things is probably more vulnerable to disruption than the regular good old internet. For critical infrastructure, we can ask how we would continue to operate in the event of a malicious incident, and to what degree our control over these infrastructures is shared with a foreign manufacturer. Products from China require special attention. The combination of increased Chinese espionage, a new national intelligence law in China, pervasive surveillance, and heightened military tensions have led to a dangerous situation. But the US and China share a deeply integrated industrial base. Disentangling this would be costly, although some now talk of a divorce. China is not the only country that could exploit cyber vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure. Iran and Russia have probed pipelines and other infrastructures, including electrical power. There are several steps we can take to reduce risk. The most obvious is to improve network and device security. DHS's Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, should be the center of this effort. The development of security standards is essential. The NIST cybersecurity framework is a strong start, but it needs to be amplified and expanded for specific technologies. Any defensive measure must accept that we cannot keep a determined opponent out of our networks. This means that we must also consider measures to increase resiliency and allow for continued operation in degraded environments. This is the goal that DoD has. Better security requires oversight. This is clearly a task for the committee, but also for CISA. Finally, a defensive approach by itself is inadequate. The U.S. needs to develop credible threats to deter foreign attackers and persuade them that interference in critical infrastructure comes with the unacceptable risk of retaliation. We do not have this now. That would be a useful thing to do. We haven't talked about the security premium, which is what many of us call it. It's come up several times. In part because it's subsidized by the government. There might be a Chinese intent that's worth looking at in this subsidy, but it means for companies, and we see this particularly with Huawei, they must choose between buying cheap, good equipment or more expensive equipment that's secure. And that's a difficult choice. I'm not sure everyone will always come out in the same place. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. Now I'd like to recognize Ms. Gagliostro to summarize her statements in 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today to share our thoughts on cybersecurity in the pipeline industry. My name is Rebecca Gagliostro, Director of Security, Reliability, and Resilience at the Interstate Natural Gas Association of America. INGA is a trade association that advocates regulatory and legislative positions of importance to the interstate natural gas pipeline industry. Our 28 member companies operate approximately 200,000 natural gas producers and consumers. In my role at INGA, I work directly with our members to ensure that our pipeline infrastructure remains resilient, safe, and secure. Cybersecurity is a priority for the natural gas pipeline industry. INGA member companies work diligently to secure our nation's critical gas transmission infrastructure from both cyber and physical security threats. Cybersecurity has been identified as a top operational risk by the executive leadership of our member companies, and we take the management of this risk very seriously. Last year, in recognition of this priority, INGA's board of directors set forward with its commitment to pipeline security statement. This statement enumerates specific actions that all of our member companies are taking as part of their security program. The statement emphasizes, among other things, our commitments to following the Transportation Security Administration's pipeline security guidelines. Industry security efforts seek to reduce the risk posed by a successful attack targeting our infrastructure. A foundational element of a well-informed risk management program is comprehensive information sharing. This is a key point that I would like to emphasize. Real-time actionable information is vital to ensuring our pipeline operators are equipped with the latest intelligence on threats. Information sharing is occurring today between INGA member companies and other industry stakeholders through the work of our Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, also known as ISACs. However, this is not industry's responsibility alone. It's imperative that we also have a cooperative working relationship with our government partners to help facilitate information sharing. We would like to note that there is strong information sharing occurring today with our partners at TSA and the Department of Homeland Security, and we would like to see this relationship continue. INGA believes that TSA's pipeline security program is making a difference as it continues to improve. We understand that TSA has accepted the Government Accountability Office's recommendations for improving the management of its pipeline security program, and it is now in the process of implementing changes in response to those recommendations. INGA strongly believes that if followed, these recommendations will help to make a stronger and more robust program. The increasing threat of nation-state cybersecurity attacks and interdependencies across our critical infrastructures means that we must work together across industry and government to protect ourselves against threats. The work that TSA and the Department of Homeland Security are doing through the National Risk Management Center is a very positive step towards the end goal of protecting the nation from cybersecurity threats. Threats to critical infrastructure cannot be evaluated in isolation. All critical infrastructure is being targeted. Therefore, we must identify the best ways to work together to protect our national security. In October, TSA and DHS announced their joint partnership on the Pipeline Cybersecurity Assessment Initiative, which is working to conduct comprehensive cybersecurity assessments of pipeline infrastructure. Assessments play a critical role in providing the assurance that these programs are working. TSA has already piloted one INGA member assessment in 2018, and our members continue GAO believes that progress has been made in securing our pipeline infrastructure, and we should continue to focus on improving TSA's pipeline security program. The growing threat of nation-state-backed attacks requires a coordinated and comprehensive approach, backed by strong information sharing across all critical infrastructure sectors and across all federal agencies supporting national security. TSA's ongoing work with the National Risk Management Center is helping to bridge that gap. We urge Congress to support TSA's efforts to improve its program and provide the necessary guidance and funding for additional program management staffing and cybersecurity expertise that can work alongside the National Risk Management Center and support the Pipeline Cybersecurity Assessment Initiative. We believe that this, in addition to the efforts that are already underway, will help to make TSA successful in its mission to protect the nation's pipeline infrastructure. Thank you.
Very much for your testimony. Now I'll recognize Mr. Olson for 5 minutes.
Chairman Correa, Chairman Richmond, Ranking Member Lesko, and members of the subcommittees. My name is Eric Olson, and I'm the Vice President of the Rail Security Alliance. The Rail Security Alliance is a coalition of North American freight rail manufacturers, suppliers, unions, and steel interests committed to ensuring the economic and national security of our passenger and freight rail systems. On behalf of our coalition, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the critical topic of securing our surface transportation systems against cyber and privacy threats. With thousands of miles of railroad covering the United States, freight rail regularly transports everything from sensitive U.S. military equipment to toxic and hazardous waste every day. On the passenger side, millions of Americans rely on the commuter rail system daily. The U.S. rail system is also highly sophisticated, relying on a constantly expanding network of technology that dramatically increases its risk to cyber attack and hacking. Today, I want to draw the committee's attention to a particular threat arising from foreign investment in this industry that jeopardizes directly the future of America's passenger and freight rail systems. This threat is China. China is strategically targeting the U.S. rail manufacturing sector with aggressive anti-competitive tactics. And how do we know that? Well, to date, they have secured 4 U.S. metropolitan transit contracts in Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles, largely by utilizing anti-competitive underbidding practices. These aggressive and anti-competitive activities are not unusual for China's state-owned rail sector and raise grave national concerns, security concerns that demand immediate attention. Without decisive action, America's industrial, military, and other government interests could be forced to rely significantly or wholly on rail cars made by the Chinese government, thus creating massive cyber vulnerabilities that threaten our nation. The Made in China 2025 initiative, a key component of China's 13th five-year plan, identifies the rail manufacturing sector as a top target for Chinese expansion. This initiative has systematically and deliberately driven strategic investment and financing activities of the state-owned China Railway Rolling Stock Corporation, CRRC, in third-country markets and the United States. CRRC is wholly owned by the government of China and has 90% of China's domestic market for production of rail locomotives, bullet trains, passenger trains, and metro vehicles. In just the last 5 years alone in the United States, we have witnessed CRRC execute a business strategy to take market share in the U.S. transit rail manufacturing sector, deploying near limitless financing from its home government, allowing CRRC to establish itself as a formidable force in the U.S. rail transit manufacturing base. Emboldened with these contract victories, CRRC continues to target other U.S. cities, including our nation's capital. In September, the Washington Metropolitan Transit Authority, WMATA, issued a request for proposal for the new 8000 series Metro car. This RFP includes numerous technologies which are susceptible to cyber attacks. Whoever is selected to supply rail cars for WMATA will become a partner in the day-to-day operations of a metro system whose stops include the Pentagon, the Capitol, as well as unfettered access to DC's tunnels and underground infrastructure. As CRRC itself has stated, their objective is to conquer the rest of the global rail market. Need I say more? Whether they be state, local, or federal funds, American taxpayer dollars should not be used to subsidize the activities of a Chinese state-owned enterprise and compromise American security. Based on the experiences of Australia, which this graph denotes, whose domestic industry CRRC was able to wipe out in under a decade, we are equally concerned that CRRC will leverage its growing presence in the U.S. transit rail production to then pivot into freight rail assembly. We cannot allow this to happen here. Yet the Department of Homeland Security deems the U.S. rail sector as part of the nation's critical infrastructure, running through every major American city and every military base in the nation. We have had extensive discussions with representatives from DoD, and based on those discussions, I'm confident that the Secretary of Defense would express his concerns on this matter as well. As China's CRRC becomes more dominant, should the United States rely on a Chinese state-owned enterprise for the production of our country's freight and passenger rail cars? The position of RSA is a resounding no. The strategic targeting of our nation's infrastructure by the government of China and its state-owned enterprises poses a fundamental threat to the fabric of our critical infrastructure and is a pressure point for malicious cyber actors to threaten not only the economic and national security of the United States, but to our standing as a global power. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you for your statements. I'd like to recognize Mr. Holquist for 5 minutes.
Chairman Correa and Ranking Member Lesko for convening this joint hearing today. My name is John Holquist, and I'm the Director of Intelligence Analysis for FireEye. My team of over 100 devices, incident response, researchers monitoring the criminal underground, and many more sources to understand the global cyber threat. FireEye is supporting the transportation and energy sectors here at home. We're protecting TSA with email and web inspection, and we're providing support through DHS's subscription to our intelligence reporting. At DOE, we're supporting network and file inspection, malware analysis, and protecting their data from threats down to their endpoints. The department is the largest civilian agency consumer of our intelligence reporting, which provides focused visibility into the threats targeted at the energy sector. Today, I will focus primarily on threats on the horizon that FireEye is watching develop in the Middle East, Ukraine, South Korea, where Iran, Russia, and North Korea are the most active. Despite a dearth of recent specific examples of pipeline targeting by state actors that we have observed, targeting the sector is consistent with the behavior of several state actors who have carried out disruptive and destructive operations. Pipelines sit at the nexus of two well-established interests for state actors, energy and transportation. For example, oil and gas has been the major focus of a long-term destructive malware campaign by Iran in the Gulf. Though these attacks have targeted critical infrastructure organizations, they have primarily affected business-focused IT systems rather than sensitive control systems. Nonetheless, Iranian-sponsored threat actors have caused significant, costly disruptions from 2012 to as recently as 2018 using this capability. The Middle East was also the scene of the most disconcerting attack on control systems we have observed. An industrial plant there suffered a disruption when attackers inadvertently triggered a shutdown using malware we call Triton. They triggered the shutdown because they were attempting to manipulate automated safety systems, one of the last lines of defense to protect human life. We believe this activity originated from Russian government organization. Transportation and logistics systems have been an unrecognized but fruitful focus for state cyber attackers as well. During and between attacks on Ukraine's grid, attempts were made by the same Russian actors to gain access to rail, air, and sea transportation routes and hubs to varying degrees of success. Many of the companies which posted major losses from the NotPetya ransomware incident and the hundreds of millions of dollars were also in the logistics business, despite this industry not having been specifically targeted. Such a pattern could indicate that logistics organizations may be especially economically vulnerable to incidents of this nature. Like pipeline operations, transit networks have been subjected to ransomware operations and denial of service attacks, which have on occasion resulted in disruption to service. Ransomware, which has affected many municipal services, has been used to hold transit systems hostage in return for payment. The websites associated with mass transit systems, which are often crucial to their business, have also been subjected to denial of service attacks, in some cases disrupting travel. Both ransomware and denial of service are capabilities used by state actors. The complexity of transit networks and the potential for cascading economic consequences from disruption bear similarities to pipelines. However, transit networks offer an additional attraction to would-be attackers. Transit is a highly visible sector with which the public regularly interacts. This factor is especially relevant as many cyber attacks appear to be more focused on psychological effects and undermining confidence in institutions than creating lasting physical effects. It's important to bear in mind that our adversaries are not necessarily preparing for a doomsday situation or any lasting blow, but an asymmetric scenario where they can project power onto our shores. Ultimately, their aim may be to sow chaos rather than to achieve some complex military objective. Thank you again for the opportunity to participate in today's discussion. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
I thank our panelists for their testimony. If I may, I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. And I'll start out with Mr. Lewis. You made a comment at the end of your statement about credible threat. We need to be a credible threat. Can you explain that a little bit?
Certainly, thank you, Mr. Chairman. When we look at the behavior of Russia, China, Iran, and to some extent North Korea, they are the most dangerous attackers, but they're also very calculating, they're very rational, and they ask themselves, if I do this to the Americans, what is the likelihood that the Americans will do something back? And if they believe there is no risk that we will do anything back, they're more likely to undertake some sort of hostile or coercive action.
In this committee last year, full committee of Homeland, I asked the question, at what point does a cyber attack constitute a declaration of war in the United States? Any thoughts?
This is was that an attack that caused death or destruction or casualties would qualify as justifying a forceful response. Unfortunately, we haven't seen very many of them, and if you look at what the Russians did in 2016, it wouldn't fall under that category. So this is something that I believe the intelligence community and Cyber Command are working through. We need a new framework. If you cause death or destruction, you fear a risk, that you fear that the U.S. will retaliate. If you don't do that, people kind of feel like they can get away with it.
If you threaten our democracy or destabilize our government, is that an act of war? And I'd ask that question to all of you.
Under the current legal construct, the answer would be no, right? You could make a case that by threatening the political integrity of the United States, it would qualify as an act of war. But our main problem is that we know this happened, we became aware this was happening in April of 2016. That's almost 3 years ago, and we still have not done very much back.
Mr. Olson, you talk a little bit about the challenge of Chinese assets, Chinese buying essentially their way into our markets. They're buying their markets, and you talk about a threat. Could you relate that back to the China's new 27 intelligence law that compels companies, Chinese companies, to cooperate with the Chinese government?
Sure. So I'm not fully familiar with the law itself. I mean, I've read articles about it. I mean, our concern is that this is a wholly owned, state-owned enterprise that has a board of directors with members of the Communist Party, and we know that when they set up shop here in the United States that we believe they're being directed by Beijing. And the cyber issues, privacy issues, and just the economic security that stems from that is our main concern from RSA's point of view.
Same question to Mr. Holquist.
It's not uncommon. I'm not familiar with that exact regulation, but it's not uncommon for Russia or China to enforce or compel companies to work with their cybersecurity or their signals intelligence agencies to gather information.
Thank you very much. I'm going to yield the remainder of my time and now recognize the gentleperson from Arizona, Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first question is for Mr. Hultquist. Hello, sir. I have a couple questions into one. Basically, how well do you think the industry uses ISAC, the information, you know, where you share information with the industry? And my secondary question is, what are the risks from insider threats?
I have actually previously worked at a couple of the ISACs, actually the Surface Transportation and Public Transit ISAC. I worked there briefly before moving into a cyber world. They've made a lot of great strides in the cyberspace, and several of them are very mature and are making a big difference. One of the problems, though, is that we sometimes take this myopic view of our sector, and we fail to see threats coming because we are overly focused on just our own sector. And it's important to look at our own sector, but the actor who turned out the lights in Ukraine was also targeting air and rail and all these other sectors, not because the lights were particularly. Sometimes if we focus too much that way, we can kind of miss that. I'm sorry, your second question?
What is the risk of insider threats, like people that are working for, let's say, the rail system or passenger rail?
Many of
pipelines.
Many of the major critical infrastructure incidents that we've seen throughout history have involved a insider component. A contractor who didn't get hired on is upset about their situation and decided to lock things up. Or I believe there was a situation where they pumped toxic stuff into a critical infrastructure.
And what can be done about it, do you think?
Probably a more complex or a more robust vetting process and recognition that when people move in and out of an organization, security measures need to be sort of re-looked at. Particularly, do they still have accesses, things of that nature.
Thank you, sir. My next question is for the gentleman with the rail system. And you had mentioned, I read this article that was in I think it was the Washington Post, entitled, "Could a Chinese-made metro car spy on us?" And I think you were quoted in this. And some of the transit authorities in this article, the Chicago Transit Authority, the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, they basically said that none of the critical software components were being produced in China. What are your thoughts on that? Are they misspoken? They said that they're considering bids from CRRC, but that the critical software components are not made in China. And in fact, one of them, the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority spokesman said the design process for new rail cars includes a cybersecurity analysis based on a U.S. Department of Defense military systems safety standard. So I'm glad that we're bringing this up because I think it's a legitimate concern, but it seems like, at least from these people's spokesmen, that the critical infrastructure is not made in China. Can you comment?
Yes. What I would say to that is that our concern is you can try to mitigate, and we heard from Ms. Proctor earlier that the cyber concerns are ever evolving. We do know that, I don't know all the parts or the list of the parts, but many parts are being made in China. The shells for Los Angeles and for Boston are being made in China and shipped to Springfield, Massachusetts. So our position at RSA is risk avoidance. We don't know what can be put into a shell. We don't know what technology can be hidden there. The Chinese have a long view. Attack, but we also think of it from a point of privacy. When you have access to the tunnel, the CCTV, can you get access to the Wi-Fi system? We know how they profile their own citizens, and it doesn't take a lot to leap to the fact that maybe you could do that here, especially in the metro region.
Thank you, sir. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Ms. Lesko, and I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Chairperson Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This would be for Ms. Gagliostro and Mr. Olson, and it's basically describing your relationship with TSA, DHS as a whole, but TSA and CISA. Has there been real stakeholder involvement in the implementation and the goals outlined in the Pipeline Cybersecurity Initiative? And Mr. Olson, in your view, are DHS and TSA being proactive enough in sharing information about cyber threats and best practices within rail systems? And to both of you, what could they be doing differently or more?
So I would say that, yes, there has been real stakeholder involvement beyond the efforts of the Pipeline Cybersecurity Initiative, because, as you know, that initiative was only announced in October. But prior to that, TSA has been working to build its security program for over a decade now, has a very strong working relationship with industry. We regularly engage in pipeline sector stakeholder calls to share information about threat indicators that they're getting, and also information about the tools that they're providing to industry to help us with their security programs. I think that the work that TSA is doing right now to have more coordination with DHS and the CISA office and the National Risk Management Center is a very positive step in the right direction of looking more comprehensively across these nation-state threats in particular that are targeting all critical infrastructure, to make sure that we're empowering industry to learn from how these threats are looking.
To echo, I agree that from my understanding, the folks at the Rail Security Alliance represents our private industry, and we know that they've been talking, TSA has their private briefings. We heard that from Ms. Proctor earlier, that they have been doing classified briefings for members, both in the passenger rail sector and also the freight rail sector. I think there can always be more and more involvement. We've certainly reached out to them to have conversations as well on this point. What I would say on the what could be done, what could they be doing more, is DHS actually has a study sitting at Homeland Security right now that they need to complete by the end of the fiscal year. We would love to work with you all and work with the Department of Homeland Security on this study and ensure that private sector's voice is heard as they're completing this risk assessment of what state-owned enterprises could, how they could affect the U.S. transit and freight rail market.
Thank you for your time. And Mr. Chairman, I do have prior commitments, so I will yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Chairman Richmond. Mr. Cleaver, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was mayor of Kansas City all during the 90s up until 2000. And I can remember one of the most frightening period of my term as mayor came when we received word, we were not notified, but received word, that there was very likely going to be shipment of and taken to Nevada, Yucca Mountain. And there was a lot of resentment. Largest freight rail site in the country, and St. Louis, 200 miles away, is number 3. We are and have been extremely concerned over the years about the transportation of waste, but also how vulnerable we are, particularly in the Midwest, because when we, no matter what the discussion is, probably even freight, we tend to focus on East Coast, West Coast, maybe a little part of the North Coast, and the Midwest is wide open. I always like to remind people that the first major terrorist attack in this country occurred right in the Midwest at Oklahoma City, at the Murrah Federal Building. It has nothing to do with rail, but the point I'm raising, Mr. Lewis and Mr. Olson, is that there seems to be, I'm not sure that there is any appropriate attention being given to that part of the country, where a lot of the rail is centered.
I tend to agree with you, Congressman. I do know that the Class 1s, The freight rail manufacturers are all working on these issues and working on the cyber aspects of this and the security aspects of this. RSA's position and has been as our concern is allowing the Chinese to come in and make freight rail cars and be part of the system and what the security challenges come with that. As you know, freight rail carries grain from toxic waste to military equipment, and as soon as our view is from RSA, as soon as you allow the Chinese into the system and they're building cars, they're able to track where all these things are going, get a bird's eye view on when we're moving commodities, when we're moving helicopters, when we're moving people, and that is of grave concern for us from a national security perspective, and we share your concern, sir.
Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Congressman. You know, I think there's two questions you always want to ask. Does the device connect back home? And there's a surprising answer to that increasingly as we connect things to the internet. I was reading yesterday about a smart doorbell that was inadvertently relaying people's voices back to China. So rail cars a good target, rail lines a good target, they're a traditional military target, a good target for disruption. The other thing you'd want to ask, though, is when is it in the opponent's interest to do so? And in that sense, they're looking at it from a national perspective. They're looking at it from where the least defended parts of the country, where can they achieve the most effect? And so in that way, maybe the Midwest is a good target.
Yeah, I would argue that there is some evidence to suggest that it is the target. And of course, my question, Mr. Chairman, is you know, when are we going to give the necessary attention? I mean, that's, you know, when I'm asked, you know, the question, I'm no longer in the mayor's office, but people want, you're now in Homeland Security, so when are they going to give us the attention that they've been giving New York and Boston and San Francisco and Los Angeles? And I guess I should say it's still up in the air until something happens. Is that?
Attention has gone to the largest metropolitan areas, and so really the top 12 SMSA, standard metropolitan statistical areas. And so the question is, can we expand that? It's a question of cost and also of personnel, as we've heard. So that tends to mean that if you're not in the top 12, the top 20, you might not be getting the same attention as others.
Thank you, Mr. Cleaver. Now, thank you very much. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleperson from New York, Ms. Rice.
So, Mr. Lewis, just to continue on that, so you had said at the beginning, right after the end of your original statement, you talked about the cost factor. Can you just expound on that a little bit more?
Certainly, thank you. And we've heard from the other witnesses, too, that in many cases, Chinese companies are subsidized. It's part of a larger, very aggressive mercantilist policy that the Chinese follow. And so that allows them to offer products at a lower price. And the information we saw in Australia and them squashing the competition there, you can find that in other industries. So you have a subsidized price with pretty good equipment, some unknown risk for surveillance or disruption. And people have to, the buyers have to make a decision. Do I pay more for security or do I go with the lower cost? And
So why is the federal government allowing them to make that decision at their level, regardless of whether the money that they're using is state money or federal money? I mean, I would assume if it's federal money, then we have absolute say over the their decision-making process. But is it that difference about what bucket of money they're taking it from?
Thank you. We have not come to terms until recently with the fact that there's risk in buying from China. So our supply chains are deeply integrated. And so you know when you go to the store and you turn things over, very often it'll say made in China. And up until a few years ago, people thought, oh, well, you know, they're going to become a market democracy. This is fine. So we're just starting to think about how we disentangle that. And part of it might be asking about what technologies are sensitive, where's there additional risk. You've seen all the news about Huawei in the papers, and this is on.
What are we waiting for in this field?
I would just add, I mean, Congress did examine this issue last year when it came to Federal Transit Authority dollars. There was actually a one-year ban put in place in the Senate T-HUD bill. It was unfortunately stripped out of the final version that we passed, you guys passed on February 15th because it was deemed controversial, because there are certain members that have state-owned enterprise Chinese facilities in their district. And so they're trying to preserve jobs back home. I will also note, yeah, you're right. When it comes to the bucket of dollars, there are some of these local governments, because of the deep discounts that the Chinese are giving. The case of Boston is a very poignant one, where the Chinese came in as below, as much as 50% below some other competitors. And so Massachusetts waived FTA dollars, so there's no Buy America protections, there's no federal dollars involved in this project, and they just use state money. And therefore, the Chinese are able to build many components and the shells and ship them over here. So unless we have a outright federal ban or some federal law that says you can't do this, I would assume that states continue to buy because of price.
So I'm just wondering how we sound the alarm bell. I mean, is it, I just don't know. I mean, if we are allowing elected members of Congress to be more concerned about preserving jobs in their district than they are national security, we have a problem. So if you wouldn't mind, Mr. Olson, just talking a little bit about how you said that you felt that the Secretary of the Department of Defense was open to, can you just expound on that more? Because this has to be done. If this administration does not think that this is a priority, it's not going to trickle down. It's just not.
Agree with you wholeheartedly. We're a 3-year-old organization. We started because we saw this market entry in such a quick fashion, and the 4 contracts quickly awarded to CRC. They've also built a freight rail assembly facility in Wilmington, North. So opportunities like this to testify and get in front of more members, I mean, we're advocacy. We're trying to get in front of as many members of Congress, to state and local officials, to raise the alarm bells, and we are partnering as much as possible with officials within the Trump administration to raise more awareness.
Well, I want to thank Chairman Correa very much for actually, putting this hearing together. I want to thank all of you so much, because we sit here in this little bubble here in Washington, and we need, one of the very common theme that I've heard from everyone who has sat at that table is we have to keep the lines of communication open. This is not a private sector issue. This is not a public sector issue. This is a keep America safe issue, and our democracy safe issue. And I hope that, going forward, and I know with people like you we'll be able to, I hope we can have this conversation in a bipartisan fashion. So thank you all for being here, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Rice, and I agree with you about sounding the alarm. That's a very interesting question. Now I'd like to recognize Ms. Watson-Coleman from New Jersey.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if we have these companies that are owned by the Chinese company making things in the United States of America, technically we could have professionals from security, cybersecurity, whatever, to be able to go in, announced and unannounced, and check, right?
Of course.
We probably could.
Yes.
Do we? Do you know if we do?
It doesn't work, and so that's the main problem.
It doesn't work, why?
It doesn't work because, first, a lot of the, I thought I did, pardon me. A lot of the technology is connected back to the manufacturer, so they can do updates. You don't know if it's malicious traffic or innocent traffic. Second, there's just a lot of opportunities in a rail car or an airplane to hide.
We're just trying to figure this out. Mr. Olson, this one paragraph. What do you think the federal government's role should be here in ensuring that this doesn't happen here?
So first off, RSA's continued position is taxpayer dollars should not be used to be subsidizing a state-owned enterprise from China, period, end of story. Secondly, would love to work with all of you as we look at other ways to do bans or outright bans on this technology from being on our system. I think it's too scary to allow a Chinese government-directed company to operate in the United States, especially when they're building a good chunk of the materials in China itself.
Because the interest actually is not blowing us up as much as just owning us.
Tracking us.
Owning us. WMATA, which oversees the Washington metro system, was currently working to procure new rail cars and update its procurement requirements to include the enhanced safeguards.
RSA's position is, as Mr. Lewis stated, it's never enough. If you're going to be building components and parts in China, you can never do enough to mitigate. Our position at RSA continues to be risk avoidance. Let's just not buy them.
So let's not allow our money to be spent on purchasing Chinese.
Correct.
Okay, I'm good. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much for those questions. Now I'd like to recognize a good lady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Having just come in, let me first of all thank the witnesses of the first panel and thank those of the second panel. Events. I have been on this committee since 9/11 and have seen the maturing of terrorist potential and utilization of now technology, different from bringing down a plane or using it as a torpedo into major structures here in the United States, though it certainly is well known that certain elements still believe that aviation is a crucial and serious part. But I would be interested, or infrastructure is a crucial and serious part of potential of attack in the United States. And so I'm going to ask each of you a question as to whether or not you are, do you think we're fully prepared for zero-day potential events? Start with Ms. Gagliostro.
So I would say in dealing with any sort of cybersecurity threats, the most important way for us to be prepared and respond is through working with our federal partners on having strong information sharing on what we're learning. So zero-day threats are always a challenge because it's what you don't know yet, but I think being cognizant of the threat indicators and patterns of behavior and paying attention to those so that we can be alerted to those threats as quickly as possible.
You think the United States should address those questions through legislation that would emphasize the partnership between the federal government and the private sector?
I think the best way to address that is through strong partnership between the federal government and private sector.
So legislation that dictates that would be helpful?
To the extent that we don't think it's effective today.
Mr. Lewis?
Thank you. First, I distinguish between state and non-state actors. No terrorist group currently has the capability, nor will acquire in the foreseeable future the capability to launch a damaging cyber attack. This has been true for years. It's based on evidence from a number of...
Can you repeat that, please?
No terrorist group currently has the capability to launch a damaging cyber attack.
But please know that my zero-day is not limited to terrorists, limited to foreign state actors, nation states.
Exactly right. That we have four very capable opponents who have certainly done the reconnaissance to launch these kinds of attacks against...
Why don't you just recite their names for the record?
Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Right? They all have the capability. It's a question of when they would use it. So on the defensive side, we need all the work that you've heard from my colleagues perhaps some improvement in standards. On the offensive side, as we discussed earlier,
be effective focusing the government on those issues?
Ma'am, I've asked senior officials at DHS if they need more legislative authority. Their position is no, but I think it would be useful to look and see where there are gaps in the existing legislation that might help them do better at protecting.
Then they do need it because there are gaps. Mr. Olson, and then just Mr. Holkers, you follow.
I would agree with my colleagues on the panel here, and we would not oppose further legislation if it gives more authority to fill, as you said, gaps for DHS. You know, our position from the Rail Security Alliance is that we've already allowed the Chinese in, and that we need to stop the bleeding and not have them further infiltrate more transit systems, and especially the freight system. So we're looking at it from that angle of hardware in the United States already.
Thank you.
We've had good success anticipating a lot of these events by looking at the places where these actors are most active, Ukraine, the Middle East, South Korea. So I would argue that getting that information, that we have the observables out of those spaces and to the private sector who would likely bear the brunt of any attack is probably the most important thing we can do.
And so if you have legislation that focuses on some of the elements that you just mentioned.
Absolutely. Enforcing public-private partnership, I think, would be really important.
Just last question, Mr. Chairman. Cybersecurity is becoming harder because of the connected nature of wireless technology. How long can we secure large, complex systems when very small devices can pose risks? Whoever feels most capable to answer that question, I would be delighted.
I'll start. We can't secure them now, so it's hard to see how it would get much worse. But I think that as you add more and more connected devices, the ability to create some sort of havoc will grow. We talked about the smart doorbells. Another one I just heard about is, you know, those invisible braces you get? Some of them are connected to the internet. And you can just think of endless numbers of complications between smart cars, smart ships, robots. We are moving into a world where the number of things that can be hacked is growing exponentially.
Thank you. So, anyone else on how do we? Yes, sir.
We add more potential for disruption, but we also add more vectors for the threat actors to gain access to critical systems or systems that we care about.
Anyone else? Mr. Chairman, I just conclude by saying that there are gaping holes with our cyber system. This committee is best suited to try to address those questions, and gaping holes can create opportunities for havoc. And I think this committee and the oversight on transportation, natural gas, is crucial in its work, and hope we will pass legislation dealing with some of these very large holes that
I concur with you, Ms. Jackson. I think we've got our job to do here in terms of addressing those gaping holes. It seems like every time we turn around, there's a new toothbrush with a chip on it. And so when you're brushing your teeth, somebody's going to know how many times you do it a day. And my point is there is no privacy anymore, and it looks like all of our information is interconnected some form or another, whether it's a commercial venture or a state somewhere around the world. So, Mr. Lewis, you intrigued me again with your comments about the deterrence. Is there a price to pay for what and when is that trigger? Good questions. I want to thank all the witnesses for their valuable testimony and all the members here for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond to them expeditiously and in writing. And pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be held open for Thank you to all the committee members, both committees, or I should say panels. We stand adjourned.